How does a work of art actually convey meaning? How does a series of painted strokes suggest a figure, or a lily convey purity, or a tooled halo suggest sanctity? Well, one way of answering questions like these, which are really questions about signs and the communication of meaning, is by using what's called semiotic analysis. Here then, I want to give you a brief sense of what semiotic analysis is and of how it offers some productive models that we can use in thinking about how works of art function. Semiotic analysis first took shape more than a century ago in the field of linguistics and is largely associated with the work of two men, Ferdinand de Saussure, who was a Swiss linguist, and Charles Peirce, an American scholar. Both men were basically interested in how signs, and here they meant words, either spoken or written words, communicate meaning. They wanted to know, in other words, how a series of mere letters or sounds can imply a complex concept or call to mind a particular thing. Well, one of the first steps taken by Saussure was to argue that a sign was actually composed of two elements, which he called a signifier and a signified. The signifier in his scheme was the word, and the signified was the concept or thing for which it stood. So, when I pronounce the word rose, in other words, you might picture the actual flower. And if you do, we've created a functioning sign, which is rooted in social and linguistic convention. Well, that seems simple enough, and it's pretty easy to see how it might be applied to works of art as well. Take this altarpiece, for example, which was made for the cathedral in Siena, Italy in the 1330s. Against a field of luminous gold leaf, we see a series of painted forms. These are the signifiers, and they represent, cumulatively, a complex signified, drawn in part from the Bible. At the center, the Archangel Gabriel kneels and announces to a surprised Virgin Mary that she will bear a child, while two locally important saints look on from the margins. The painted signifiers convey, then, a signified that is appropriate to the religious context in which the altarpiece functioned. Again, that may seem obvious, so let's push things further. Saussure also made the critical observation that, in language at least, the link between signifier and signified is entirely arbitrary, with very few exceptions, that is. The sound or the shape of a word bears no literal relationship to the concept for which it stands. There's nothing about the word dog, D-O-G, that is, that resembles an actual dog. It's merely an arbitrary sign. And it's a sign that works furthermore in relation to other signs. To a certain extent, signs are flexible, which is why in English we can pronounce dog as dog or dog, and still get our meaning across. But Saussure also observed that words work through contrasts with other words. Dog works as a signifier in part because it's different from frog or log. Meaning, in other words, is arbitrary, but it's also the result of a larger system of structural contrasts. Could this be said of pictures? Well, maybe, but with a few adjustments. Obviously, painted forms are not entirely arbitrary. It's important in an altarpiece like this that the figures actually look something like real figures, and that the vase of lilies at center actually resembles a vase of real flowers. But look at the gestures of the Archangel Gabriel and Virgin. There's nothing really inevitable about these, and the artist could presumably communicate Gabriel's grace or the Virgin's bashful sense of surprise in a variety of ways. The really important thing is that the gestures not be confused with different possible meanings. That is, the Virgin could presumably finger her mantle in various ways, all of which might effectively convey her emotional state here. But if she were represented with a balled fist, say, or an open palm facing Gabriel, the result would be quite different. So painted gestures may be culturally specific and tied to convention, but they're also largely arbitrary, and their meaning comes from contrast as much as from their form. But let's get back to the big picture. Another important distinction made by semioticians involves the difference between denotation and connotation. Denotation is pretty straightforward. It's the literal or generally obvious meaning of a sign. Connotation, by contrast, is subtler and involves associations or implied meanings. So a balloon that's printed with an image of a recognizable Disney character denotes that character. But a balloon in the shape of a Valentine relies centrally upon connotation, for while it doesn't look anything like a literal heart, it can nevertheless imply romance or fondness. In the 1950s and 60s, the French theorist Roland Barthes became quite interested in this distinction and thought at some length about how it might be used in the study of popular visual culture. For instance, he wrote an essay on this magazine cover. Match was, at the time, a popular news weekly with a wide circulation in France, which was at that point still an important colonial power. What, asked Barthes, does this image denote? Well, answering that's pretty straightforward. A black teenager, apparently, who wears a French paramilitary outfit and salutes, while looking slightly upwards. To a French audience at the time, moreover, political realities suggested that the young man was likely a citizen of one of France's African colonies and was saluting a French flag. But what then is connoted here? Well, that, for Barthes, is where things get really interesting, and where an image like this does its major propagandistic work. For, according to Barthes, the implication was that this young man actually respected French power and authority, and that France is thus, by extension, a great colonial empire with loyal black citizens willing to fight on its behalf. None of this is actually literally spelled out, of course. Rather, to Barthes, it's connoted or suggested by the image, which functioned to reassure a nervous French population about the stability of its empire. Barthes also thought closely about the related strategies of advertisers. In an even more famous essay, he offered a semiotic analysis of this ad for products made by Panzani, which produced pastas and sauces. On a denotational level, Barthes noted, we see a string shopping bag full of Panzani products and fresh produce against a red background. On subtler levels, though, the image is constructed to make certain insinuations. The stuffed bag and the items that seem to tumble forth from it recall a cornucopia or horn of plenty and suggest that we can make a full meal out of Panzani products and a few tomatoes and mushrooms. There's also an implication of freshness. It looks as if we've just returned from market. And finally, Barthes noted that the ad also connotes what we might call Italianicity, for the dominant colors are red, white, and green, that is, the three colors of the Italian flag. Advertisements, then, work simultaneously on denotative and connotative levels to construct meanings or position their wares. All right, let's add one last complexity. Saussure and Peirce also noted that signs can be assigned broadly to three different sorts of classes. Some, as we've seen, are icons. They look or sound like the object they signify. The word buzz might offer a useful linguistic example here. It's an instance of onomatopoeia in which the word actually sounds like the principle it's communicating. Most signifiers, though, are purely symbolic. Their connection to the signified is, as we've seen, conventional rather than literal. And finally, there are some that can be said to be indexical, that is, signs that are the physical traces of the thing they represent. Take my voice in this recording as an example. It sounds like me, or stands for me, because it's the actual outcome of sound waves that emanated from my vocal cords. It's an indexical residue, linguists might say, of my speech. And these terms have clear potential when we turn back to the visual arts. When we look at a painting by Jackson Pollock, for example, we're confronted with a mass of indexical signs, skeins and ribbons of paint that are the direct result of the motions of the brush or the can in Pollock's own hands. These spiraling forms aren't meant to look like or symbolically represent something, but they do nevertheless clearly convey, due to their indexical status, the gestural motions of the painter. By contrast, the terracotta warriors of Xi'an in China are clearly iconic in the sense that they were cast and modeled to resemble believable figures. They may not be specific portraits in the modern sense of the word, but their detailed representations of armor and physiognomy relies upon a basic likeness. And for an example of a more symbolic form of visual sign, we might turn to early Christian mosaics, such as this one from northeastern Italy. Sure, there are iconic elements here. The bishop at the base of the composition is meant to look like a bishop. But the sheep to his left and right aren't meant to be seen as literal sheep. Rather, they're symbols that signify his spiritual flock or his congregation. So these terms can help us to speak with some precision about how visual meaning is construed or communicated. But let's be clear, even single works of art can involve a combination of icon, index, and symbol. We call this polysemy. It's a sort of multidimensional, layered form of signification. Here you see a photograph of a performance by the artist Kazuo Shiraga. Shiraga was connected to the Japanese Gutai group, which was deeply interested in extending the lessons of Jackson Pollock and in using their bodies as expressive vehicles. Gutai literally means something like body tool. In this performance, Shiraga wrestled with a field of mud in a sort of enthusiastically pointless, existentialist combat that vaguely alluded to the sheer struggle of artistic creation. In one sense, then, it's a symbolic work. The mud isn't really meant to look like anything, but to stand for any material or medium that confronts any artist anywhere. But it's also, at the same time, an iconic work. The artist, wearing a loincloth, is clearly represented here, and he looks something like a sumo wrestler as he engages in this primordial duel. Finally, at the same time, it's also indexical, in at least two senses. The marks in the mud are the traces of the artist's gestures, and the photograph that we see is a direct physical record of the fall of light upon film. In other words, this image is in fact a dense condensation of different semiotic strategies or modes of signification. And so, when we look at a work of art, we can use semiotic analysis as a means of articulating some of the strategies implicit in that work and of identifying how it creates meaning. Look at the words that lead from Gabriel's mouth on the left to the Virgin Mary's ear on the right. On the one hand, they're arbitrary symbols. Here they're in Latin, but presumably the angel spoke Hebrew to Mary. But they're also iconic forms, clearly recognizable letters that spell out the divine news, denoting God's plan for Mary, but also connoting in their elegant Gothic forms the sanctity of the moment. And finally, they're indices or indexes. Raised in slight relief above the gold ground, they remind us that this is, after all, a handmade product, and the outcome of physical work as well as elaborate thought. They're polysemous signs, in other words, that open up, like semiotic analysis itself, in various directions, and remind us of the complex ways in which artistic meaning originates and circulates.
Semiotics, it's the study of signs and symbols and their use or interpretation. So we'll get into that a little bit more in the next parts of the video. Primarily, the book is a study of how narrative films create units of meaning and how the history of film theory has approached this question. So the central question that Christian Metz is definitely asking is this: is film a language? And the subsidiary question he might be asking is, if so, in what sense is narrative film a language? And the third question he might be asking is, how have previous film theorists understood narrative film to operate like a language? So if you're at all familiar with the history of film theory, you might say, wait a minute, I know of previous film theorists or film thinkers that have thought of film as a language or have strove to make films with the ambition to make film like a language. The biggest collection of thinkers in that tradition are definitely the Soviet montage theorists, including people like Sergei Eisenstein and Lev Kuleshov. In fact, Sergei Eisenstein wrote, "Now why should the cinema follow the forms of theater and painting rather than the methodology of language, which allows wholly new concepts or ideas to arise from the combination of two concrete denotations of two concrete objects?" What Eisenstein is saying here is he has an ambition to use montage, that is the synthesis of different shots, and the juxtaposition of those different shots to create something new. He thinks that that idea of taking two concrete things, yoking them together in succession, is a lot like the way language works. The way that language sometimes takes two concrete words and unites them to create something new, or takes words in succession and forms them to make a sentence. And part of Christian Metz's text is to acknowledge the history of film theorists, people like Eisenstein, and think about how they thought about film as a language. He'll say, in Potemkin, that is Eisenstein's most famous film, 3 different lion statues filmed separately become, when placed in sequence, a magnificent syntagma. We'll get to that word syntagma in a little bit. The stone animal seems to be rising and is supposed to yield an unequivocal symbol of the workers' revolt. It was not enough for Eisenstein to have composed a splendid sequence. He meant it to be, in addition, a fact of language. So Metz is saying a couple things here. First, he's reminding us of the fact that Soviet montage theory, which is all about the fact that film is and can be understood as what you create by juxtaposing different elements from different shots, feels like the logic of a language. Either individual letters coming together to form words, or individual words coming together in succession to form sentences. But not only that, he's saying that Eisenstein's belief that the particular choices of shots in succession would yield meanings that were unequivocal, that were absolutely understood by spectators in the same way that you can absolutely understand the words that are coming out of my mouth right now. That belief that the choice that goes into shots will create unambiguous meanings is part of the Soviet montage theorist's ambition, that film strive to communicate meaning the way that language communicates meaning. And as a bit of a preview, Christian Metz will not necessarily agree with this position. And you can see a simpler version of this belief that film is like a language in the Kuleshov effect. Remember this experiment that's supposed to communicate the idea that a face, when juxtaposed with an object, will create a synthesis of an emotion on that neutral face. So when a face is juxtaposed with soup, it creates the idea of hunger. When that same face is juxtaposed with a dead child, it creates the impression of sadness. Or when the face is juxtaposed with a reclining woman, it creates the impression of lust. Once again, the ambition here is to structure individual thoughts together in a sequence and construct new things, the way that language constructs ideas through the juxtaposition of letters to form words, or words to form sentences. So we might simplify Christian Metz's position on this way of thinking about film in this way. He might say, okay, yes, the Soviet film theorists aspired to think about film as a language, but let's be more rigorous about the film-language analogy in the wake of structural linguistics. So what is structural linguistics? Well, you can find nods to structural linguistics whenever Metz mentions, either in name or in concept, the thought of Ferdinand de Saussure. So I'm going to be weaving little bits of de Saussure's thought throughout this series of lectures. But the first thing that I want to do is to simply introduce this idea of structural linguistics, what it means. Structural linguistics denotes schools or theories in which language is conceived as a self-contained, self-regulating semiotic system whose elements are defined by the relationship to other elements within the system. So in its simplest form, structural linguistics is an approach to studying language that privileges the idea that languages are self-enclosed structures or systems of meaning that have particular rules. And structural linguistics is part of a broader discourse of thought called structuralism. Structuralism is a method of interpretation and analysis of aspects of human cognition, behavior, culture, and experience that focuses on relationships of contrast between elements in a conceptual system. Without a doubt, the biggest name in structural linguistics, and frankly in structuralism in general, is in fact Ferdinand de Saussure, whose most influential writings have been brought together in this book called Course in General Linguistics. Almost everything that Christian Metz is doing in this book, Film Language, is to ask the question, is film like a language through the lens of Saussure's structural linguistics? So you might put the fourth question this way. When I ask, is film a language, what I really mean is, in what sense is narrative film a self-contained system of meaning analogous to the way that language is a self-contained system of meaning? If you want a spoiler for Christian Metz's answer to this question, the answer is no. Film is in fact not a self-contained system of meaning. However, his entire book will look at what can be productively said in juxtaposing the structural linguistic thought of de Saussure and the way in which films tell stories. So how are we going to be exploring this question? Well, we're going to spend the majority of our time on Chapter 4, some points in the semiotics of the cinema. And just to be transparent, I'm mostly going to be looking at this set of excerpts from this article that are produced in the Brody-Cohen Film Theory Anthology. The way I want to proceed is to look at the title, Some Points in the Semiotics of the Cinema, and summarize what are some of those points that Christian makes in starting to ask the question, what would a structural linguistic semiotics of the cinema look like? So in other words, what are Christian Metz's points for investigating film as a language? Well, the first is that he's going to be looking at narrative cinema only. He'll say this: we know since the observation of Bella Balache, André Malraux, Edgar Morin, Jean Mitry, those are a bunch of film theorists, and many others, that the cinema was not a specific language from its inception. Before becoming the means of expression familiar to us, it was a simple means of mechanical recording, preserving and reproducing moving visual spectacles, whether of life, the theater, or even of small mise-en-scène, which were specifically prepared and which, in the final analysis, remained theatrical, in short, a means of reproduction. So what does he mean by this? He means there is no system of narrative signification evidenced in these early cinema shorts. One of the main reasons he thinks that there's no cinematic signification is that for Metz, signification is primarily going to arise through edits, through cuts. And these early 60-second films by the Lumiere brothers don't have cuts. They're single continuous takes. And Metz is not being naive here. He understands that there is, in a sense, a very marginal and minimal kind of storytelling happening in these two films. But he's saying what I'm looking at is the way in which codes of editing have emerged 10 years after 1895. And those codes are what he's going to think about. So narrative cinema only. Number two, the shot is not analogous to a word, it's a phrase. Remember how we were talking about that intuitive idea that film narrative is like a language? Well, it's maybe like a language because the way that words are strung together to form sentences, maybe shots are strung together to form sequences or scenes. He's going to say, well, there's one problem with that. So remember the idea of the Kuleshov effect, that there is this intuition that to understand how the effect works, you want to kind of boil down each shot into a singular concept or a word. Neutral face plus soup equals new concept, the concept of hunger that we can see on the face of the actor. Metz is going to say this particular fantasy that film is like language in this way is false. And we can see that logic here. The shot, he says, is therefore not comparable to the word in a lexicon, rather it resembles a complete statement. Okay, but what's his reasoning? So let's look at this with a more constructive example. I have here a singular still from a shot from Alfred Hitchcock's Strangers on a Train. It is a close-up of a gun. Christian Metz has a famous line about a close-up of a gun, particularly a revolver. He says, in this book, Film Language, the close-up of a revolver does not mean quote-unquote revolver, a purely virtual lexical unit. But at the very least, and without speaking of the connotations, it signifies here is a revolver. So what does he mean by this? Well, what he's trying to say is that when you're watching a narrative film, when you see a sequence of shots being shown to you, you're always aware of the idea that the shots are being shown to you by some invisible force that you might want to call the enunciator or the narrator. And I don't mean a narrator that is located within the world of the film, but just the idea that because film is a narrative, or we're talking about narrative film, storytelling, every single image that you see is being shown to you. It's being selected for the strict purposes of relaying a story. So it would be wrong to look at a single shot of an object and think that this shot of a gun simply translates to gun. At the very least, he's saying, it translates to the statement something like, here is a gun that I'm showing to you, dear spectator. And not only that, because he's saying that this is a limit case situation. If I were to actually look at this particular moment from this fiction film, Strangers on a Train, by Alfred Hitchcock, I would have to situate that shot of a gun within the narrative and within the shots that come before it and come after it. And if I were to be more precise about what that shot of that gun actually is saying, I might say something like this. Here is the gun resting in a drawer that Guy, our protagonist, has just opened, which he received from Bruno, the antagonist, who sent it to him as the murder weapon to kill Bruno's father. This is a more precise approximation of what that single shot of the close-up of the gun actually means. Single shots within narrative films of objects or people or even landscapes can never simply translate to single words. And we'll get back to that idea in a little bit. Number 3, cinema is a language, or langage, not a language system, or long. Christian Metz will clarify. He'll say, contrary to what many of the theoreticians of the silent film declared or suggested, the cinema is certainly not a language system. It can, however, be considered as a language, to the extent that it orders signifying elements within ordered arrangements different from those of spoken idioms, and to the extent that these elements are not traced on the perceptual configurations of reality itself, which does not tell stories. Filmic manipulation transforms what might have been a mere visual transfer of reality into discourse. So you might say that this is actually one of the main theses of the entire book, Film Language. Because what Christian Metz is trying to do is to ask that question, to what extent is film like a language within the view of language provided by structural linguistics? And his answer is to say that film does indeed construct meaning through a set of codes that operate in succession. However, film is not a self-contained system of meaning the way that English or French or Japanese is. And you'll see him pose this question of cinema as language or language system throughout the entire book. In fact, it's the title of his previous chapter, The Cinema, Language or Language System, from chapter 3. But now I want to look at a particular passage within that chapter that I think will clarify the logic of this distinction. He'll say, there's indeed language system, but neither the image discourse nor filmic discourse are language systems. Whether language or art, the image discourse is an open system, and it is not easily codified with its non-discrete basic units, the images, its intelligibility, which is too natural, its lack of distance between the significant and the signifier. So I understand that this passage is probably very confusing and it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to break down this sentence into its component parts, because looking at each of these component parts is going to help us understand what Christian Metz means when he says that film is a language, but not a language system. Christian Metz is saying in this sentence, film is not a language system the way that English or French or Japanese is a language system, because its basic units, the images, or you might say the shots, are non-discrete basic units. In other words, he's reiterating that idea that I said earlier, that the close-up of a revolver is not equivalent to the word revolver. Just like the close-up of the neutral face in the Kuleshov effect is not equivalent to something that we might call face. And the first reason that we discussed is the idea that every shot within a film is not a word, it's a proclamation. Here is a gun that I'm showing you, dear spectator. But not only that, think about all the ways in which each of these images, these shots, cannot be reduced to a single word. Consider the top image. This is indeed a picture of a gun, but it's not just a gun, it's a particular kind of gun. It's also a gun from a particular angle, with a particular set of lighting, with a particular background. It's also resting in a drawer. Take the same idea of the Kuleshov effect face. In the experiment, the face is supposed to be neutral, thereby demonstrating the idea that the face gains its signification from the objects that it's juxtaposed with. But do you think that face is neutral? Can you stare at it and start to see signification within the face itself? I see a small smirk happening on the face's left side. I also see a particular pattern of shadow. The left side of the face is washed out, the right side is in shadow. It's also a particular kind of person, and that person appears a particular way. This is what it means to say that images are non-discrete. They are full of detail. And that detail always has the possibility of signifying beyond the very basic general concept of something like quote-unquote gun or quote-unquote face. So that's one way in which film is not a language system, because its individual components, unlike words and language, are not discrete units that can be juxtaposed to create sentences. Number 2, film is not a language system because of its intelligibility, which is too natural. So what does Christian Metz mean here? Well, what he's trying to say is that the way in which human beings acquire the knowledge to understand how narrative functions in cinema is not analogous to the way that human beings acquire the knowledge to understand how language works. The grammar of understanding French or English is a lot more complex and abstract than the grammar of understanding how film works. And partly to support this is a famous line from Christian Metz that I quite like. He said, film is difficult to explain because it is so easy to understand. What he might mean here, that film is easy to understand, or that its intelligibility is too natural, might be exemplified by the image that I'm showing you here. The relationship between these two shots, the shot of Jimmy Stewart looking through his binoculars and the shot of the man that he's seeing, implies a code of connection. That code is saying that the second shot is indeed the contents of what Jimmy Stewart is seeing, right? It's not natural that that connection between these two shots is communicated to us. It is indeed a code. But the way in which the two images come together to form that meaning, he says, is not purely analogous to the way that the words strung together in the sentence, "the cat is on the mat," come to signify the idea that a cat is sitting on the mat. He thinks that these images come to signify what they signify almost too easily, too naturally. They're not quite abstract enough. Third, film is not a language system because of its lack of distance between the significant and the signifier. What does he mean by this? So I'm going to give you a quick explanation and then I'm going to give you a more detailed explanation. Here on the left side of the screen, I have two signifiers. One is a shot of a close-up of a gun that we've already seen. The other is the word tree as it's written. Those are both signifiers because they're signs that signify something that is not presently there to me. If we take Metz's explanation, perhaps that gun signifies the idea here as a gun. And perhaps below it, those sequence of squiggles that we take to mean the word tree signify the idea of a tree. Metz's point here is to say that there is not a clear analogy between the way that the image of the gun signifies here is a gun and the way that the word tree signifies the idea of a tree. Let me explain that a bit further by turning to Ferdinand de Saussure's course in general linguistics. Fundamental to this book is the idea that language is composed of signifieds and signifiers. When I speak the word tree to you, that sound that's coming out of my mouth, tree, is a signifier. The idea of a tree that forms in your mind when I say that word tree, or that sound, tree, is the concept, the signified. Now, one of Ferdinand de Saussure's main points is this. The relationship between the signifier and the signified is arbitrary. Well, what does he mean by that? Well, what he means is that that sound that is coming out of my mouth, tree, has no resemblance, has no motivated connection to that thing that's outside that has bark and leaves and that sways in the wind. Think about all the kinds of signs that you encounter in life. A painting of a tree is indeed a sign of a tree because it brings to mind that thing that we have in our minds, which is called a tree. But a painting of a tree is not an arbitrary relationship to a tree. It's motivated because it looks a lot like a tree. But the word tree, as it is coming out of my mouth in English, or the word árbol in Spanish, those sounds have no motivated attachment to that concept. It's completely arbitrary. It depends on the code of the language and how you learn that language. In the same way, those squiggles that you're seeing that form the letters T-R-E-E have nothing to do with that actual thing of a tree. They're arbitrary. They signify within the language, and that language gets you to that idea of a tree. Now, if we were to compare this relationship between signifier, that is the thing doing the signifying, and the signified, that is the concept that comes to our mind, if we were to compare that way of it working in language to how it works in film, we might see something different. So, the signifier in film might be the shot of a gun, and the signified is the idea, here is a gun. But notice the way that the image of the gun and how it signifies is not similar to the way that the sound tree signifies the idea of a tree. The sound tree and the way it's written has an arbitrary relationship to that concept of a tree. But can we say that the image of a gun, which really resembles a gun, has an arbitrary relationship to the idea, here is a gun? Of course it doesn't. It resembles a gun, and that resemblance is the reason it's not an arbitrary relationship. It's motivated. It's connected. It's, in Christian Metz's words, way too close a relationship between signifier and signified. So Metz will say this: cinematographic signification is always more or less motivated, never arbitrary. That's because narrative films are not abstract. They are condemned to recording the world. And when you record the world, you're picking up images that resemble things within the world. But when I speak to you, the sounds that are coming out of my mouth are not recordings of the world. They're a completely abstract set of sounds that you have learned to master as communicating concrete things within the world. So those are the ways in which cinema is not a language system. But we still haven't quite explained what it means to say that cinema is still a language. And one of the first ways that we'll begin to understand that cinema is a language is to give you an example of how we might study cinema as a language. And the first thing that Christian Metz will say is that if we're going to do this right, we're going to study denotation and not connotation. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, let's go back to that example of Jimmy Stewart looking and then cutting to the thing he's looking at. These two shots indeed signify. And if I'm speaking strictly of denotation, I might say this about the second shot. I might say the second shot, by virtue of following the first shot, represents or denotes that this is the contents of Jimmy Stewart's optical point of view. Right? That is one way to say, communicate the denotative meaning of that second shot. Connotation, however, is any kind of signification that goes beyond what is immediately communicated as narrative information. If you're interested in, say, the symbolism of the antagonist Thorwald wearing a crisp white shirt, then that kind of meaning that you want to make as an interpretation is not denotation at all, it's connotation. It has to be dug for. It has to be explained. It is not, say, the bare bones narrative signification that is communicated through film codes. That a shot of someone looking followed by an image is largely going to communicate that that image is an example of what they're in fact looking at. What else does Metz say about denotation? Well, he kind of summarizes what can count as studying film denotation here. He says, how does the cinema indicate successivity, precession, temporal breaks, causality, adversative relationships, consequence, spatial proximity, or distance? These are questions of film denotation. What are examples of these? So, for example, temporal breaks. The fact that in classical Hollywood cinema, a fade generally means a major temporal ellipsis. Well, that is a code that has been instantiated through multiple uses. It tells me the relationship between those two shots is one of major temporal ellipsis. Or a dissolve. A dissolve in classical Hollywood cinema generally signifies a minor temporal ellipsis. And we might even say something that is less codified, but more innovative, like this famous match cut from 2001: A Space Odyssey, is still operating in terms of denotative meaning. In other words, if I watch this film and I watch it correctly, I know that that cut from the bone to the satellite is signifying a very, very, very long temporal ellipsis. That's not a symbolic interpretation, that's denotation. So that's an example of how film can communicate temporal breaks. What about precession? The idea that what I'm seeing now actually comes before what I just saw. So one word that we have for the idea that a shot shown in succession can come before the shot that it came after is flashback. This is a famous flashback from the film Casablanca. If you watch this film and you watch it correctly, you're not going to struggle to figure out the idea that when we do this slow, blurry dissolve from Humphrey Bogart's face to the Arc de Triomphe, we are in fact going back in time. The denotative meaning of that line between the first shot and the second shot is denoting precession. And you know that because you've watched films before. You inherit the code of the film language. What about spatial proximity or distance? When I watch this little clip of a sequence of faces, I'm getting all this denotative information about the relationship between those two faces. I get the sense that they're looking at each other, not toward the same direction. One of the reasons is because I've inherited the code of the 180-degree rule in my bones. That if one character looks screen right and he's followed by a character that looks screen left, I'm going to probably believe, even though it might not be true in profilmic terms, that those two people are looking at each other. I'm also getting the idea that they are distant from each other, not standing right next to each other, right? How do I get that information of spatial proximity or distance? Well, I get it through cinematic codes that I've inherited like a language.